Okay, folks, well, here we go with lesson 3, and it covers the material in chapter 4 on assessing needs. So, uh, why do we bother to assess needs? I guess it relates to something that I always say, instead of ready, aim, fire, which is what we should do, oftentimes we do ready, fire, aim. And so, before we actually do something, I hope it makes sense that we need to figure out what needs to be done, first of all, where we need to focus our efforts. So here are the learning objectives for this lesson. I want you to be able to define the terms need and needs assessment, define the terms capacity, or at least understand what these are, community capacity and capacity building. Explain why it's necessary to do a needs assessment as part of program planning. Differentiate between primary and secondary data and data sources. Be able to list and describe various methods for collecting primary data. To be able to locate and utilize secondary data sources as part of your needs assessment. To explain what's meant by a health impact assessment, and to be able to, after we're done with this, at least feel comfortable conducting part of a needs assessment for a priority population. And here's the key terminology from this particular lesson. There's a lot here. A lot of it relates to data collection and data collection methods. The first term, basic priority rating, is how once we've determined what the needs are, how do we determine which of those needs has the greatest priority. And then, of course, you see some of the other terms from the previous slides, and so on and so forth. So just take a look at those before moving on to the next couple of slides. All right, so what is a needs assessment? A needs assessment provides objective data to define important health problems, to set priorities for program implementation, and to establish a baseline for evaluating program impact. So, before we move forward with any kind of health promotion programs, we have to know what the status of the health problem is. And so by doing a needs assessment, we understand what the current status is, what percent of the population has type 2 diabetes, what percent of the population has cardiovascular disease, what percent of the population is obese, and that becomes the baseline. And so then we compare, after we've done our health promotion efforts, we'll reassess those disease factors, cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, and we'll see whether or not we've made a change from baseline. Another definition of a needs assessment, I like this one because it has the term gap in it. So it's a process by which the planner identifies and measures gaps between what is and what ought to be. So we'll look at what the current status of the particular disease is that we're looking at, or condition, and then we'll determine what the gap is between that measure and what it ought to be. So what it ought to be, we might look at the best of the best that are out there. Best of the best is a term that's used in Healthy People 2020 as a standard or a benchmark. So, for example, if we're looking at obesity rate in Georgia, we already identified, I think in one of our previous classes, that the best state is Colorado. So maybe that becomes our benchmark. So, what's the gap between obesity rates in Georgia versus Colorado? And maybe that becomes our marker to shoot for. Some other terms for a needs assessment that you might see in the literature: community analysis, community diagnosis, community assessment, and relating back to the previous slide, a gap analysis. All right, so here are those capacity terms. Capacity, basically the resources that individuals and organizations have to be able to devote towards a community need. Community capacity, which are the characteristics of communities that affect their ability to identify and address social and public health problems. And then capacity building, if we don't have the resources, what do we need to do to build the capacity to be able to address these problems? A small example of that is, the Bicycling Club of Milledgeville. The Bicycling Club of Milledgeville is a club where people get together to ride bikes, so there's a social and physical aspect to it, but it's also been doing bicycle advocacy in the community. But it doesn't really have the capacity to be able to do that, to its fullest potential. And so through some grants that we've gotten with Live Healthy Baldwin, we're going to be providing the bike club with some funding to be able to hire somebody to be the advocacy director and actually to start a separate advocacy organization. So, with that funding, we're helping to build the capacity of the bike club to be able to do the advocacy work. And then there's a term called categorical funds. Categorical funds are funds that are earmarked by a particular organization to do something specific. For example, the funding that comes from the American Heart Association all must be devoted towards cardiovascular disease. From time to time, the Georgia Department of Public Health will get funds, and it will allocate funds for specific priorities. So, one year it might be obesity or childhood obesity. Another year it might be type 2 diabetes. But those funds are, again, pigeonholed or earmarked for specific problems, as those problems come up on people's radar screens, and so those would be called funds. Okay, so as we enter into a needs assessment, here are some questions that we need to keep in mind. Who is the priority population? What are the needs of the priority population? Are there any subgroups within the priority population that have the greatest need? For example, the priority population may be African Americans, and the problem may be prostate cancer. Okay, so are there any subgroups within that priority population that we would be more inclined to address than others? Well, at what age do men start to get prostate cancer? Are there things that can be done to prevent it? So, we would want to focus on men, we would want to focus on their significant others, and we'd probably want to focus on a particular age group that's at greater risk for prostate cancer than others. So that's how you identify that. If we're looking at obesity, the groups that are at greatest risk for obesity are low-income minorities, particularly Hispanic and African American, and the data tells us that. So those are the kinds of things that we would try to determine through a needs assessment. If we have identified particular subgroups, are they in a certain geographic location in the community that would enable us to access those folks and help them? Are there any things that are currently being done to resolve those needs? So are there organizations in the community that are already addressing that? Because we don't want to reinvent the wheel or overlap with what other organizations are doing. We want to pitch in to fill a gap. And then how well have the identified needs been addressed in the past? So if there have been particular programs to address that factor, were they successful? If not, why not? And what could we do differently? All right, so as we're trying to determine what the needs are, we need to understand the concepts of secondary data and primary data. Secondary data are data that are available from external sources. In other words, they've already been gathered by other organizations or groups, but they are available for us to use. And we'll look at some of those in a minute. And then primary data are data that are gathered by the program planner from the priority population in the area that you're going to be working in. All right, so sources of primary data, we have data from individuals, data from groups. So potential participants in the priority population, significant others of those individuals, individuals in the community that are what we call opinion leaders or key informants. Those are folks that are leaders in the community and that represent the feelings of other people in the community. And how do we gather data? surveys, various types of surveys. There are single-step surveys, multi-step surveys, and we'll look at those in a little bit more detail. We could also use written questionnaires. We can also do face-to-face interviews, telephone interviews. You've probably experienced the random digit dialing, RDD. So, you get a call on your phone or your cell phone, and it's a random digit dialing. Oftentimes there's a delay between when you say hello and when somebody else picks it up. Those are pretty annoying, but it's a way of reaching out to people in a random fashion to gather information. And then there are electronic surveys, electronic interviews, things like SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics and those kinds of. We can also collect data from groups, sometimes an efficient way of doing things, community forums or town hall meetings. Those can be large numbers of people. Focus groups are smaller in nature and typically have 8 to 12 participants. The nominal group process is similar, but you intentionally select 5 to 7 individuals from the priority population by virtue of the fact that they are leaders and that they represent the people in the priority population. And then there are various forms of observation, obtrusive and unobtrusive observation, things like photo voice, where you ask individuals to take a camera or a video camera and to document the living conditions in their community and the needs. And then windshield assessments or walkabouts, where you just go and drive through or walk through a community and make note of the kinds of things that you see. And then there are various kinds of self-assessments, health assessments, health risk appraisals, and there's some links at the end of this lesson for you to kind of play around with those. All right, here are some sources of secondary data from various organizations. The census data is a very valuable source of data, but as we said in class the other day, it can get outdated fairly quickly because it's only done every 10 years. So you get to the end of a census period and, that data that was collected 8 or 9 years ago can be somewhat dated. CDC has a great source of data, and then within the CDC there's a number of different surveys that are done on an annual basis, and I've listed those there and provided links. If you're working with young people, with youth, the YRBSS can't be beat. It's a great survey that's done, and it has a lot of factors. Students from around the country take that survey, and it gives us a pretty good indication of what kinds of health behaviors students are engaging in that put them at risk for various kinds of problems. And then played around with this a little bit the other day. The county health rankings as a good source of information. State and local agencies, health departments. The University of Georgia Department of Family and Consumer Sciences has a good database for information about counties and communities. And then there are non-governmental agencies or organizations like the American Heart Association and American Cancer Society. All good secondary data. Okay, so, how do we use that information? Well, we want to try to grab people's attention about the extent of the problem. And so we would want to pull key indicators out and present those in the form of a program rationale or telling the story of a community. So things like, 1 in 4 Americans have high blood pressure. Of these, 30-some% don't know that they have it. One that I've used before is that of all the people born after the year 2000, 1 in 3 will develop type 2 diabetes. And of individuals born after the year 2000, 1 in 2 African Americans will develop type 2 diabetes. And so those are pretty powerful statistics that you can use to help grab people's attention and help to make the case for why we need to do health promotion in a particular community. Sometimes using big numbers, 1 102.3 million American adults have total blood cholesterols in excess of 200 milligrams per deciliter, and so on. So, big numbers sometimes can have an impact, and of course you could utilize some social math as well to, again, try to make it more real for people. All right, so here's the steps to conducting a needs assessment. It's not rocket science. It kind of follows the steps to conducting research, but obviously we want to do a needs assessment before we do anything else. This is the first step. We're going to determine what the purpose and the scope of the needs assessment is. Then we go out and gather our data, whether it's primary or secondary data. We analyze that data. We might use statistics for that. We might use some kind of qualitative analysis if we're doing interviewing of people. And then sometimes it's important to identify those factors that are linked to the health problem so that we can identify our program focus. And then finally, we want to validate the prioritized needs. So determine the scope of our needs assessment, gather the data, analyze the data, identify the factors that are linked to the health problem so that we know what our program focus is going to be, and then we want to validate those prioritized needs. All right, so in analyzing the data, in that middle step, we want to look at factors, in the precede-proceed model that we put up on the board the other day. The first step is looking at the quality of life of those in the priority population. And those are social factors like income, like education level, crime, housing in the community. Those factors affect health, so we want to look at those conditions. Then we want to look at the social conditions and perceptions that are in common with the people in the priority population. So, again, the social indicators like unemployment, crime, income, education, and so on. Those are important things to look at. Then we want to look at those social conditions and whether or not they're linked to health promotion, and if so, how. So what's the relationship between income and education and health? What's the relationship between crime and health? What's the relationship between housing in the community and health? So, those are things that we want to look at. And what are the health problems associated with the social problems? So, high crime that causes people to stay indoors, not get outside, are then getting too much screen time and not enough physical activity, and therefore they're at risk for obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And then, we'll look at a rating system here in a second for prioritizing problems, but we want to ask ourselves which health problem is the most important one to change. Maybe if we change one thing, it will affect several things. All right, so prioritizing needs. There's we want to ask the question, which problem has the greatest impact? Are certain groups at particular risk for that problem? Which problems are most susceptible to intervention? In other words, which ones can we make a difference in? Which problem is not being addressed by other agencies? So it's another part of the gap analysis. If we see that this particular group, the health department, is focusing on this, then we might want to focus on something else. Which problem has the greatest potential for an attractive yield of benefits? In other words, in the time that we have, with the resources that we have, which problem can we make the greatest change in? And are any of the problems ranked nationally or regionally as part of a health promotion initiative like Healthy People 2020 or the Georgia SHAPE initiative or Live Healthy Georgia? Those are national or state level health promotion programs, and can we tie into any of those to help bolster our case? All right, so here's this mathematical rating system. So, let's say our needs assessment comes up with 8 needs in the community. Okay, we can't realistically address all of those things. So we've got to have some way of prioritizing those. And so, here's a mathematical formula that incorporates a number of different factors, A, B, C, and D. So A is the size of the problem, and with that we'd want to look at epidemiological incidence rates. So of 3 or 4 or 5 health problems, which of those is the highest in terms of this particular community? So that can be a fairly objective measure. The seriousness of the problem, is a little bit more subjective, but what we're asking there is, if we don't do anything about this, what are the consequences? And the consequences can be, it's going to get worse, more people are going to get this problem. Economically, it's going to create some real problems, certainly in this community or even regionally or statewide. And then we'd want to look at what are the effectiveness of the various interventions that have been used elsewhere to address this problem. And so, we'd want to come up with some sort of a rating on a scale from 0 to 10 with the effectiveness of those interventions. And then finally, it's almost a catch-all category here, and it's an either-or. So if any of these factors are missing, it results in a number 0, and you can see in the formula where that multiplier is, and so you multiply anything by a 0 and you're going to get 0. So it means that if any of these things are not in place, then this particular health problem gets a very low priority rating. So things like propriety, and that means that do we have the standing to be able to do something? If we're a nonprofit organization and the problem is in some employer's workplace, what are the chances that we're going to be able to do something there? So we don't have propriety. So that would be a 0, and that would result in us not being able to do anything about that problem in that particular setting. Economics are the intervention strategies that we're identifying that we're going to do. Are they just simply too cost prohibitive to be able to do something? Are the methods that we might employ acceptable? Are they legal? Do we have the resources or the capacity to be able to do that? Again, this acronym is PEARL, which incorporates all of those different things: propriety, economics, acceptability, resources, and legality. And if any of those are not there, it results in a 0, which blows up the formula, and you ends up with a low rating for that particular thing. So hopefully you can see how that works. All right, and then there's a comprehensive assessment that's out there. It comes out of some national organizations. I think ECHP is the organization that developed the HIA. It's something that I went through a couple of years ago. Our state health department came down and did a training in Macon. It's a fairly intensive 3-day process, so you're trained to do health impact assessments. Very involved, but health impact assessments, a combination of procedures, methods, and tools by which a policy, program, or project can be judged as to its effect on the health of the population. And so you would do this health impact assessment in a particular community or in a particular neighborhood within a community. And HIAs are based on these 4 values. One is democracy, so the involvement of all people; equity, so we keep in mind that we want to create a more equitable environment, an equitable society, and certainly from our perspective, we're concerned with health equity. So in many communities, there is inequity in terms of health outcomes depending on where you live or depending on what your socioeconomic status is or your race. And then sustainable development. So are the things that we want to do in a community, are they sustainable? And then the fourth value is ethical use of evidence. So these are the HIA steps. And I think you'll see, again, a flow to this that's not unlike some of the program planning models, but screening, which is the identification of projects or policies that for which an HIA would be useful. So we might look at housing, we might look at the built environment, we might look at air quality, water quality, things like that. And then scoping, which health effects are we going to actually consider? So of all the things identified in the first step, again, let's boil it down to the factors that are most important. Then assessing the risks and benefits, developing recommendations for what to do, reporting that out to individuals in the community and key leaders in the community, decision makers, and then evaluating. All right, so I mentioned before that health risk appraisals can be an important source of primary data. Here's a few websites for you to go and play around with if you wanted to determine what your risk of cardiovascular disease or your risk of type 2 diabetes is. You can go to those websites and take a little assessment. And the third one is a general disease risk assessment, and there are probably 5 or 6 different diseases that you could take a look at: cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on. Or there's a tool on all of those things on that particular website. All right, guys, that's it for this lesson, and we will see you in class.